To expand console capabilities, manufacturers often included expansion ports for future upgrades. Systems like the original PlayStation had one, and the GameCube even had 3, just to name a few. But not every console that had an expansion port made use of it. An example of this is the one tucked underneath the NES. Nintendo never commercially released an accessory that utilized this port. So once again, modders do what Nintendo don't. This is the NES Hub, an expansion accessory that adds some serious capability to the beloved NES. Let's take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very cool mod that not only enhances the NES's capabilities, but it does it by using the accessory port on the bottom of the system, something that not even Nintendo ever made a use of during the life of the console. This is the NES Hub, a plug-and-play add-on created by a very talented modder named Timo, not to be confused with Tito. He comes from Germany and goes by his online alias RetroTime. So before we dive into the NES Hub itself, let's talk about the accessory port. Like I mentioned earlier, Nintendo never actually made commercial use of this port. It never released any accessories for it. Now in Japan, the Famicom also had an accessory port, but Nintendo did use it. It was primarily used as a way for players to use third-party controllers, since the Famicom's controllers were permanently attached to the system. Since, on the other hand, the North American NES's controllers were removable via the ports in front, there really wasn't a need to utilize the expansion port since third-party controllers and accessories could use these. Now at its core, the NES Hub is essentially a blue retro adapter. It can support up to 4 wireless controllers while leaving the controller ports empty, giving the console a more sleek appearance rather than having 2 large warts stick out in the front by using a conventional Bluetooth adapter like the one from 8BitDo do. Now, wireless controllers isn't the Hub's only trick. It also enables expansion audio functionality for the console, which gives us richer, more detailed audio from games that support this capability. We'll dive deeper into this here in a moment, but let's actually take a look at the hardware itself first. Now, rather than starting at the bottom of the unit, where seemingly all of the interesting stuff is, let's instead take a look at the top, because it probably has the most impressive part of the mod, and that is the connector itself. I can imagine all of the confused faces looking into the screen right now, thinking, why on earth is the connector so noteworthy? Well, it's because this connector does not exist. Well, I mean, now it exists, but that's because Timo designed and engineered it from the ground up. This connector fits perfectly into the NES's expansion port, and honestly, when you insert it to the console, it pretty much feels like an OEM part. It's not too tight or too loose, but has just the right amount of resistance. Once you get your hands on the NES Hub and install it yourself, you'll totally understand. So like I mentioned, the connector was designed by Timo, and with the help from the folks over at 8BitMods, Mods, they were able to get it manufactured with an injection molded interface and integrated pins. Okay, so that's enough about that. Now let's flip it over and take a look at the bottom. Here we have the ESP32, which is sort of the brains of the whole thing, and is what allows for Bluetooth controller support thanks to all the hard work that Darth Cloud has done with the Blue Retro standard. Over here, we have 3 dip switches for the expansion 2, 6, and 9 pins. And what these do is enable expansion audio. Now typically, expansion audio is activated by turning on the expansion 6 switch. However, there are some mods that make use of this pin on the expansion port. This is why Timo included the expansion 2 and expansion 9 switches, which will instead route the expansion audio signals through those instead. So no matter what mods you have installed in your NES, you'll be able to enable expansion audio support with the NES Hub. Now the last noteworthy items are the 3 ports at the right, left, and top of the hub. These are actually mini display ports, but they aren't related to video output. Rather, these actually give access to all the signals from the expansion port, grouped by controller signals, which are routed to the top, the expansion signals, which are sent over to the right side, and the CPU signals, which are sent to the left connector. What these effectively allow us to do is add additional accessories and enable future expansion. For example, Timo made this Super Nintendo controller adapter that links to the top connector and allows you to use wired or wireless SNES controllers. This particular controller adapter is housed in a really nice and sturdy 3D printed case, which, as you might have guessed, is the perfect cue to talk about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. So other future accessories that may need to make use of the NES CPU or expansion lanes can easily be accessible through these added ports, and it's really cool how Teemo even utilized the existing channels here that make connecting these accessories pretty easy and clean. It's almost as if Nintendo had built these channels in for this very purpose, which is pretty cool. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this particular example of the NES hub is a pre-production unit, but the final version will look very similar to it. Anyway, let's hop over to the bench so I can show you just how easy it is to install the hub into the NES. Okay, you'll first need to locate the expansion port, which is on the bottom of the NES, underneath this little cover. And for whatever reason, Nintendo blocked the port with another cover that's built into the shell. So you'll probably need to grab something like some flush cutters or tin snips and cut the tabs that hold the cover on. Now, I already did this on my modded NES with a clear shell, so we'll continue with this one as I really don't want to cut the shell on my original console. Anyway, with the cover removed, all you need to do is align the hub as shown and press it firmly into place. Okay, so we're pretty much done. The only thing left to do is to connect the ESP32 antenna like so, and what I'm going to do is route it towards the back of the console and stick it as high up as it'll go so that I can get the best Bluetooth reception. And there it is, the NES hub is fully installed and ready to go. That was super easy. So with the NES hub popped in, let's go ahead and hook it up to the TV and see what it can do. Now when it comes to features, the biggest one is obviously the ability to pair wireless Bluetooth controllers. So when I power the NES on, we can see that the blue LED here is pulsing, meaning that the hub is in pairing mode. Now depending on the wireless controller that you want to use, the pairing method will differ, but I'll be using this PS5 controller as an example. So by pressing and holding both the PlayStation and share button at the same time, the LED will start to blink rapidly, indicating that it too is in pairing mode. But then here you'll see that it turns solid, indicating that it has been paired to the NES hub. And as you can see, I can now use my PS5 controller on the NES, which is pretty neat. Now you can pair up to 2 controllers by default. However, if you access the Blue Retro menu system via the online portal using Bluetooth, you can enable features such as multitap, which enables up to 4-player support by emulating the NES 4-score multitap accessory. That's what I've done here, and now you can see that I have 3 controllers connected to the NES, and I'm able to play games that support that many players, such as Bomberman 2, as shown here on screen. Now, in addition to the traditional wireless controllers, you can also pair other input devices such as a wireless keyboard and mouse. Again, this is something that you will need to enable via the online Blue Retro setting portal. And of course, you are still able to use regular wired controllers, but what happens if you pair wireless controllers at the same time? Well, unfortunately, the NES hub has no way of detecting controllers that are connected to the ports in the front of the console, like for example the Blue Retro kit for the GameCube, meaning it is unable to auto-assign the wireless controllers when other wired controllers are also plugged in. So what happens instead is that we have controller overlap. What that means is if you have a controller paired to the hub and one connected to the Player 1 port, for example, both controllers will have simultaneous control over the game for Player 1. Basically, this means there really isn't a way to have a wireless and wired controller act as 2 separate controllers. This isn't a huge deal since I'd imagine most people will just use wireless controllers if they have this kit, but an interesting use case could be shared controls for playing games. For example, someone can control Mario's direction while another person controls Mario's jump function. This probably isn't the best example of a game that may benefit from shared controls, but it is pretty interesting as a potential use case for this sort of accidental feature. Anyway, one of the more exciting features is of course the expansion audio. I never played a game with this feature since only the Famicom could do this, but it's actually a pretty stark difference in quality, especially for in-game music. One of the prime examples of a game that utilizes the expansion audio is Castlevania 3. Here's a sample of the difference. So there are a handful of Famicom games that support this feature, with Castlevania 3 being one of them, but the majority of the games that utilize expansion audio are Famicom Disk System games. Now that actually brings up an interesting factoid, which is that here in the US we actually never got an equivalent to the FDS. But let's hold that thought for a moment, and I'll come back to this when we discuss the future of the NES Hub, which is pretty exciting, so stay tuned. Now of course the last feature is the ability to support additional add-ons via the 3 mini display ports. Currently, we only have the SNES adapter, which I showcased earlier, but there are plenty of potential future add-ons. Again, we'll be getting into this in just a moment. But now I want to discuss the pros and cons of the NES Hub. Starting with the pros, there really, I think, is a lot to like about this mod. It's easy to install by simply just plugging it into the bottom port thanks to its excellently designed connector, and we get quite a bit of added capability: wireless Bluetooth controller support and expansion audio. But for me, it's the future capabilities that really excite me, that should make use of the 3 additional ports on the hub. And the last pro is the price point. At $60, I think this presents incredible value. For example, one of these NES Bluetooth adapters from 8BitDo costs $25. So if you wanted to get 2 for 2-player support, that's $50 right there. For $10 more, you can support up to 4 controllers simultaneously, plus you get expansion audio, as well as support for whatever future add-ons that may come to the hub. I think that's really good bang for your buck. Anyway, just an overall great device, but now let's get into the cons. And to be perfectly honest, I really don't have any. The only one I could think of is pretty small. The one thing that bothers me just a bit is that all the electronics on the hub are pretty exposed here on the bottom. Again, not really a big deal, but it would be nice if we had a simple cover that just clips on over the hub to help protect it just a bit. I think this is a really easy fix, and it wouldn't surprise me if someone could easily design something that could be 3D printed that covers the NES hub. Honestly, other than that, I think this is a fantastic kit and really just a great add-on for the NES. Now, the last thing I want to discuss is the future of the NES hub. Now, for a good portion of the video, I've been alluding to this, but since Teemo did incorporate the expansion ports, what sort of add-ons could we see in the future? Well, one of the obvious answers would be additional controller adapters. With the current one available being the NES one, I can see perhaps a Genesis one also being added. But those are pretty boring in comparison to what Teemo has said that he is currently working on. Apparently, he's been in contact with Muramasa to bring an add-on that will allow us to connect a Famicom Disk System, or something like the FDS key, allowing us to play FDS games through the NES. Now that would be truly awesome. It looks as if this is something that Muramasa has actually released in the past, but was definitely coming in at a pretty hefty price tag. Hopefully, since there's some pretty capable hardware on the NES hub already, this can be included as a potential future software update. Additionally, Teemo is in contact with Perka, who created the Expansion Port Sound Module, or EPSM, which further improves the audio of not just expansion audio supported games, but all games by integrating a Yamaha FM synth chip and adds 15 additional sound channels. This would actually be a fantastic add-on for future homebrew games. These future upgrades really excite me about the potential of the NES Hub and what it means for the future of NES modding. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.